If you went to school in Africa or North America, millions of Africans were taken from their homes and transported to the Americas as slaves during the transatlantic slave trade, and it's likely that you learned something about it. However, did you know that there was another, longer-lasting route that these individuals could have taken? Before the Europeans began exploiting Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, the roots of the slave trade began in East Africa. The slave trade created wealth for East Africans, European and Arabs at the expense of human freedom. The widely recognized transatlantic slave trade people from West, North and Southeast Africa were the main victims of the Arab slave trade. Slavery has likely existed since the early days of human civilization, but in this lesson we will discuss the Arab slave trade in Africa. Beginning in the 7th century on the African continent, some Africans actually enslaved Europeans. Welcome to History Rediscovered, where we provide the most bizarre and unusual historical facts. This video contains some content that may be offensive, upsetting, or otherwise inappropriate for all viewers. It is recommended that viewers exercise caution. What was the Arab slave trade? The Arab slave trade dates back to 2500 BCE. Making it far older than the Atlantic on a small scale. Over time, it developed and evolved, branching into many additional slave trade routes across Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and even Central Asia. The greatest place to start when learning about a subject like this is with the Arab Peninsula's pre-Islamic history. Most of the slaves were either sold into slavery or were abandoned as youngsters. Although the latter's prevalence is unknown, we do know that it did occur, albeit on a minor scale. A small percentage of the deworms abducted slaves would have come from Europe or the Caucasus. A smaller percentage would have been native-born Arabs, some of whom were subject to legal punishment, but they were typically ransomed to nomadic tribes. Islam brought its rules and practices, along with the Pax Islamica, to the Arab Peninsula. Peace amongst Islamic states is simply known as Pax Islamica. Because of the quiet, there were no slaves arriving from raids or conflicts. The scope of the slave trade in Arabia was further constrained by Islamic laws against the mistreatment of slaves. However, those two factors alone did not put an end to the slave trade in the Islamic world. In fact, a little irony in the Pax Islamica can be attributed to the development of a far more extensive and brutal slave trading network than existed previously. The Arabs searched outside their borders for new slaves because of Islamic prohibitions against the enslavement of Muslims. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty was one of the suppliers to the Arab slave trade. Slaves from the Nile Valley or the freshly retaken Muslim territories were frequently sold by them. From all throughout northwest and eastern Africa, slaves were transported and dispersed throughout the Arab realm, throughout the Sahara. For thousands of years, West Africa was connected to North and East Africa in a number of ways via the trans-Saharan trade routes, which all passed through the hostile desert. Following the conquest of North Africa in the 7th century, a number of new groups moved into sub-Saharan Africa, establishing the first commerce routes. They first traveled south down the Nile into Nubia before turning west. Slaves were not necessarily native to Eastern Africa just because Arabs traded them there. One such group was the Arabs, who frequently obtained slaves through bloody raids. They would then make the slaves march across the perilous Sahara to the east, where the slave markets were located. The traders could also buy slaves from local black rulers, who could be either their own people or from nearby villages they had ambushed. Children were occasionally abducted from their homes and sold. They were enticed away from other people with fresh dates or other sweets before being grabbed. According to one historian, Paul Lovejoy, between 650 and 1500 AD, around 6 million individuals were taken as slaves across the Sahara. He goes on to say that around half of those compelled to travel through the desert did not make it through the sea. The spread of Islam. Around the year 633 CE, a year after the death of Muhammad, Muslim armies took much of what today is Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, the North African coast, and parts of Iran and Turkey. In 650, under Caliph Uthman, the religious holy book Quran, also written as Quran, was codified. Muslims then and now believe it to contain the direct revelations from God through the Prophet Muhammad. While Islam eventually forbid taking fellow Muslims as slaves, it did not forbid the taking of non-believers or those who opposed Islam. Slavery as an organized venture in Africa began in Darfur in 652. To keep to the terms of a peace agreement, the Sudanese leader at the time was obliged to make a payment of several hundred African slaves per year to the Arab invaders. This continued for centuries, reaching up to 6,000 slaves sent along the Red Sea route near the end of the 18th century, the peak of the Arab slave trade. African slaves were used for agriculture, labor, household help, or to be concubines or soldiers. It was only later, 1870s to 1960s, that the white European demand for cash crops, grain, cotton, coffee, sugar and tobacco, and ivory became major contributors to the demand for slaves. Across the sea. Slaves were typically taken to the Middle East, the Indian Ocean islands, including Madagascar, the Indian subcontinent, and ultimately the Americas on the next leg of their journey, which was typically aquatic after the arduous and deadly march across the Sahara. Today, this segment of the enslavement process is known as the Indian Ocean slave trade. It predated the Arab slave trade as well, but it truly took off when Muslims in Arabia started to need more slaves. This started around 800 CE, when the Muslim era and Swahili traders took control of the Swahili coast and, consequently, the sea lanes. The slaves would be transported to several slave markets around the East African coast after they reached the shore. The majority of slave voyages would have to cross the Indian Ocean, although some would terminate here. Zanzibar has the biggest port and slave market in East Africa. The way slaves were treated. It was a horrible life to lead an effort to prevent slaves from reproducing with one another, and many men were castrated as a way to crush their morale. This was a brutal practice that killed up to 60% of the men who had the procedure done. Although we don't have the same type of records for the Arab slave trade as we do for the Atlantic, we know that the slaves were not treated well between the violence and horde journey to their final destination, rape and castration. Slave dealers targeted young African females in order to sell them as concubines, a polite way of expressing sexual slaves. A practice that dates at least back to 609 to 606, the year that a slave soldier was created, was the use of some of the slaves taken from Africa as warriors. To put it another way, the slaves were utilized in battle as the first to die. Insurrection occurred in modern-day Iraq, subsequently between 869 and 883 BCE. A series of slave uprisings known as the Zanga Rebellion occurred in the city of Basra. How many slaves were there in modern-day Iraq? How many slaves were there? Because the slavers did not maintain the same kind of records as their Atlantic counterparts, it is difficult to determine the exact number of Africans who were kidnapped for the sake of the slave trade. Over the years, historians have made their estimates, and the subject can be somewhat contentious. According to one estimate, between 800 and 1700, Muslim traders sold about 1,000 African slaves annually. That number increased to almost 4,000 a year in the 1700s, before declining marginally to 3,700 between 1800, and new access to superior ships is what caused this increase in the 1700s. More slaves were needed as a result of the new trade that resulted. The development of a vast plantation complex is also largely to blame for the rise in trade. Sugar, oil, cereals, coconuts, and spices are all produced on these plantations. These were traded globally in addition to being utilized locally. Between 800 and 1920, the total was estimated by some historians to be about 8 million individuals, or 5,700 persons a year, the majority of whom would have traveled through Zanzibar. However, those researchers estimate the total to be significantly greater at 9 million. Some people believe that Paul Lovejoy, a historian, has the most accurate estimate of how many slaves were taken from Africa. He calculates about 100,000 slaves left Africa in the 17th century. 400,000 Africans were enslaved in the 18th century, and over 1.6 million in the 19th. Particularly in subsequent years, this surpasses the other projections. According to Lovejoy, half of these slaves would have been sent abroad, while the other half would have been retained to labor on the coast of East Africa after the Middle Ages. Since hard agricultural labor became more degrading for non-slaves as more slaves were transported into the Middle East, many of them found other employment, which only meant that more slaves were required to fill the vacancies. The demand for women was so great that they could fetch twice as much as men did in the markets, and women were taken at a rate of 3 to 1. In the early 1900s, even fewer slaves were used for agricultural work, though many were still used for fieldwork. European clients primarily wanted slaves to work the fields, but Middle Eastern merchants also wanted women and girls to be sold as concubines. Later, it was common for slaves to be used for clan diving to harvest pearls, especially in date farming, which marked the end of the Arab slave trade. Rather, more people were employed as domestic servants, and the luckiest slaves, if there is such a thing as a lucky slave, were used as bodyguards for rulers and the wealthy. Demise of the Arab slave trade. Though slavery was not officially outlawed in many Arab nations until the mid to late 20th century, it is widely believed that slavery is still practiced on some level today. History is full of dark spots that are too often overlooked. Later in history, the British publicly opposed the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and stated that they would work to put an end to it. However, the campaign didn't last long and wasn't very effective, and many of the slaves who were freed by the British died, while those who survived experienced very similar circumstances as before they were freed. The way the African people were treated during the Arab slave trade is just one of those terrible periods when millions of people were murdered, and many Americans and Europeans have mostly forgotten about it. Henry Morton Stanley, a Welsh explorer who witnessed the slave trade in the 19th century, said it best when he claimed that the equator smells of dead bodies and that black blood flows northward. We appreciate you viewing this wacky historical episode. If you are familiar with this other extensive slave trading network, please share your thoughts in the comments section. You ensure you don't miss any more videos. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you find the material in this one interesting.